It seems pretty much that there's only one thing you can depend on, and that is that things are going to keep changing. You can see it in our country, you can see it in our city. You especially see it here, downtown.
We have a baseball stadium with a modern look that's about to be torn down and replaced with a new baseball stadium designed with more old-fashioned brick and girder features that I suppose make it modern, or retro-modern, or neo-brick or something. But one thing that's just as old as Busch Stadium isn't showing its age and maybe never will. Maybe because the Gateway Arch remains unique. Unlike baseball stadiums, you can't compare it to what Baltimore or Cincinnati has. As we approach the 40th anniversary of the completion of the arch, we thought the story of just how it got here in the first place was worth retelling.
The arch is so critical to the city. I mean, I think had the arch not been built, would the heart of the city be Clayton? I think it was just tremendous, the impact that it's had as far as being able to keep any kind of business downtown. I just wonder what would have happened without it. I mean,
Christine Ely Smith has more than just a passing interest in the Gateway Arch. Her grandfather is the man credited with as much as anyone bringing about one of the most important projects in St. Louis history. Luther Ely Smith's story often begins in the 1930s, as his train was crossing the river back into St. Louis.
He looked down and said, "Bleh, this is awful. We need to do something. It's a disgrace." The gateway to the west, and we've got old, broken-down warehouses along the best part of the city, the riverfront, and something must be done.
The story is true, but people, even Smith himself, had been saying such things about the riverfront for a long time. Back around the turn of the century, a descendant of one of the city's founders was talking about taking this site back to his and the city's roots.
It kind of starts to manifest itself with Pierre Chateau in 1898. They start talking about having the World's Fair. And Pierre Chateau gets this idea to have the World's Fair down on the riverfront. And he says he wants to see it as a recreated village of St. Louis.
The World's Fair, of course, went to Forest Park, but civic leaders had now targeted the old Levee Warehouse district for some kind of dramatic change. These were the last days of the steamboats, and the central riverfront and its buildings were outmoded and run down.
They talked about clearing out all those structures, and remember, to them, they're not going to be historic. In 1912 or 1920, even some of those buildings are only 50 years old. So what? Remember, we had the fire in 1849, and that cleared out all that really old stuff. So in a sense, what would be historic then was already gone.
The city plan of 1907 pointed to the North African port city of Algiers as the kind of waterfront that combined beauty and function. And this is the model proposed in 1907 for St. Louis. A two-tier structure, an open area above, freight and commuter railroads hidden down below, and new modern warehouses with basement loading docks. But while this was a plan that was never carried out, neither was it a plan that simply collected dust. Harlan Bartholomew updated it 20 years later, keeping the two-level working riverfront idea but adding parking lots for thousands of commuter automobiles. He also proposed transforming 3rd Street into a double-decker highway with commercial traffic below and through traffic above. This was nearly the exact route that future planners would use to get Interstate 70 through downtown St. Louis. And while no one was envisioning this in 1928, the plan did have the elements that would evolve into the National Monument and Park. There was a featured role for the courthouse and old cathedral, and near the river, the city wanted something to commemorate St. Louis history.
The monument is seen as a focus, and they see this as a place to have a monument to the Louisiana Purchase.
If it had been built right then, St. Louis might have had a classical-style monument, like the George Rogers Clark Memorial in Vincennes, Indiana. Luther Ely Smith had been on the National Committee for this monument, appointed by his old college classmate Calvin Coolidge. And it was on the train back from Vincennes that Smith looked again at his own city's riverfront with renewed determination. The well-connected Republican lawyer teamed up with the powerful Democratic mayor, and they went to Washington with a new plan for St. Louis. Gone were the rail lines and loading docks and warehouses. This now was about a riverfront monument and park. They convinced President Roosevelt to commit federal money, not to build anything new, but just to finally start tearing down the old.
You're in the 30s, you're in the Depression, you've got the New Deal, you need to make work for people. Some people would argue that you have the arch because the CCC and the WPA needed a project for people to keep them busy, tearing down buildings.
The buildings started coming down, and if the project had continued uninterrupted, St. Louis might have gotten its classical temple, or perhaps a more modern version like the Soldiers' Memorial that was being built downtown. But the war halted the Riverfront project, and by the time it resumed, the world was a very different place. Even Luther Ely Smith, whose civic booster roots went back to the days of the World's Fair, wasn't thinking about Greek temples anymore.
He was always looking toward the future. What was the future going to be like for St. Louis? And I think that he also was not stuck in the past and with preconceived notions of what can we do on our riverfront.
Smith and others raised money to hold a national competition to design something to fill this empty space where St. Louis had started. There were 172 entries submitted. The winning design would be chosen, though, not by a local committee, but by a national panel of judges. And in putting that together, the local boosters like Smith made one of their most important decisions.
The people who were involved in putting the competition together hired George Howe, who was an architect out of Philadelphia and who was very much a champion of the modern idiom of architecture. So when the panel of judges was chosen, 7 judges, they all were champions of the modern idiom of architecture. And it's interesting that competitors like Eero Saarinen knew that the jury for the competition was composed of people with this mindset. So he designed the arch specifically to mirror older themes like an arch, like a dome, but also to be very, very modern and sleek in its design and to betray no hearkening back to earlier idioms. He wanted to win, basically. He wanted to win the competition, so he designed his entry to be sure to please the judges.
Not everyone fell in love with Eero Saarinen's bold design. Like other public art, some people didn't like it. Some people didn't get it. Some said a child could have done it. And it was still at this point only another plan. The riverfront itself would remain a big parking lot until more money could be gotten out of Washington, and that would take years. The funding finally came in 1956. Eero Saarinen and his team went back to work on the Gateway Arch project with one big problem left to solve. The city had assumed it was going to be able to move the railroad tracks off the riverfront, but the Terminal Railroad was refusing to go. In 1907, city planners had said the railroad trestle was unsightly, but that the rail line itself was essential and would have to be incorporated into any riverfront plan. 50 years later, the Terminal Railroad said this was still a vital link. So Saarinen went back to the 1907 idea of a 2-level riverfront. The museum was moved to the lower level, underground, and new tunnels were built to hide the railroad tracks. And now, several times a day, we are reminded that today's riverfront, with all its changes, is still rooted in its past.